Hi, this is Miss Gall, and today's lecture topic we're going to talk about locations of major industry. We're going to do a strong focus on where they're at in Europe and North America. The slides themselves were designed to accompany the book, The Cultural Landscape, and I may have made some small modifications here and there, but let's go ahead and dig into our content. So one of the first things we need to talk about is where is industry located? Okay, and so when we talk about historically where is industry located, we have to really start with what are called cottage industries. And cottage industries, as the name implies, are small-scale industries that are could be based potentially out of people's houses, hence the name cottage industry. And so these are basically kind of what we think of when we think of the traditional guild system and things like that, where it's small-scale, one or two people working in an operation, and then they scale that all the way up to the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, again, the development of that factory system, an increase in the use of machines, and an increase in the standardization of work and of splitting work apart into its essential tasks and having each individual person complete a separate task and just do it over and over and over again. Okay. And then we also have to look a little bit about the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And when we look at the impact of the Industrial Revolution, really what we need to look at are its impact on subsequent developments. So, for instance, on the development of the iron industry and ultimately the steel industry, right? Because steel is a lot of what we use for even today for a lot of our major manufacturing. To look at coal, which is one of the major, if not the major, energy sources of the Industrial Revolution. Coal is not cheap to transport, it's very heavy, and so as a result, a lot of those early industries start out and they are concentrated in areas where there's lots of coal, so that the coal can then be used to help generate the energy needed. Okay, ultimately that spreads to, as people want to get away from those coal mines, to increases in transportation and the development, for instance, of the rail system, and then ultimately of larger vehicles, such as cars and trucks and planes. Okay. And really a big spot where the Industrial Revolution kind of takes hold and takes off and continues this modern factory system to have a huge impact today are textiles, which are clothes, fabrics, really. And then also what you start to see is the development of chemicals that can be used to process clothes, that can be used to process foods and paints and help with agriculture and all that kind of stuff. So there's a development of a real chemical industry that we don't see prior to the Industrial Revolution. Right? And ultimately, we take those industrial techniques and we apply them to food processing, and that's where a lot of the modern agribusiness takes its hold. So if there's one of those major historical events that I'd say you should need to make sure you know a little bit about, it's the Industrial Revolution, more than probably almost anything else we're going to talk about, because it just has huge impacts. We talk about population, we talk about industry, we talk about agriculture, we talk about which countries end up ultimately being large colonial powers and hugely impactful in the world, in the development of the world today. It all traces back to the Industrial Revolution and who gets it the earliest and how quickly they adopt those techniques of the Industrial Revolution and how quickly they're allowed to adopt those techniques. So, speaking of the Industrial Revolution, this is just a map of Europe, kind of shows that early spread of Industrial Revolution. One of the nice parts is that while it does show the country lines because of all the other lines and colors and things, it becomes a little bit harder to see, so it enables you to focus on Europe more as a whole. And what we can see is that early in, it's really kind of northeastern Britain where it takes hold in the 1820s. We're talking about railways here as a way of diffusing the Industrial Revolution, right? Railways get their start and really get their foothold in Britain in the 1820s, 1830s. By the 1840s, by the mid-1840s, they are spread throughout much of Western Europe, and then ultimately they spread throughout pretty much all of Europe, and it's on the backs of the railroads that the Industrial Revolution really spreads and takes hold, and it's railroads that provide that first major large-scale form of transportation once we get away from rivers and boats. And rivers and boats are not necessarily as large-scale as you'd like to think. Okay, so now we talk about where is industry located. We got to talk about kind of where does it develop early in, right? And in Europe, those major early industrial regions develop in the late 19th, early 20th centuries are when they really are going hardcore. Okay. In North America, those heavy industries emerge a little bit later, but they spread a lot faster than they do in Europe. Okay. And late 19th, early 20th centuries, again, really we're talking 1850 to about 1930. Major heavy industry kind of arrives in North America about the 1870s, right? But by the end of the First World War, 1919, the U.S. has overtaken Europe to become the world's biggest economy. East Asia, that industry emerges still later, right? So it's really, especially if we're talking about Japan, which is the first major East Asian country to industrialize on any kind of a large scale, it doesn't really get there till about the 1890s. But again, especially in the case of Japan, it spreads so much quicker and so much more efficiently than it does in either Europe or North America, largely because the Japanese government is able to mobilize literally the entire society with the idea of catching up to Europe and North America and of being able to operate in terms of world power on that same scale. So, quick look at a world map, right? Kind of look at what is dollar value of major manufacturing. Okay, and this is maps from about 2011, so data's probably 2009-ish, right? In $1 billion. Okay, so when we say 1,000 billion, that's really $1 trillion or more that the U.S. manufactures. Okay, value added, that means that we add that much extra to something somebody else has already kind of started to build, right? Canada, much of Eastern Western Europe, 100 billion to 999 billion, right? This is also not necessarily hugely surprising. China, same thing, right? Not hugely surprising to stop and think about the fact that so much of what we buy and purchase today has like a made in China label on it. Okay. And if you stop and think about it, this roughly matches in a lot of ways our development maps. Again, it makes sense. There's kind of a progression of most of your people work in farming, and then as you industrialize, most of them work in manufacturing, and then as you industrialize still more, the manufacturing becomes focused on value added, and so it's not necessarily that you're building products from scratch so much as you're assembling parts that other people have built and making the new product significantly more important than the whole. So we also, secondarily, we look at this map and what we can see is those areas with little dots are major manufacturing regions, right? So in the U.S., it's centered kind of around the Great Lakes all the way across to the Atlantic Ocean, and that's at about Pennsylvania, by the way, if you're not familiar. Then we've got much of Britain, a large swath of northwestern Europe, right? A large swath of Eastern Europe and Russia, and then also some areas on the coast of China, which, you know, is where all that stuff that says made in China, that's largely where it gets made, is those special economic zones on the east coast of, or sorry, I guess that is the east coast of China. And then also major manufacturing that occurs in Japan, right, which is largely, Japan, it's largely electronics, also some vehicles and stuff like that. In China, it would be textiles. Eastern Europe, I believe they focus on steel and similar sorts of things, right? Western Europe, Great Britain, again, we're talking about automobiles, we're talking about high-end, super high-end electronics, things like that, right? And at the United States, actually, that major manufacturing region has gradually shrunk. We'll talk a little more about that in a couple of slides here. So talk about our industrial areas in Western and Eastern Europe, and this is just a little bit closer of a map, right? Again, we see much of the modern United Kingdom, especially kind of the northwest portion of the island of England. And then some specific areas in Western Europe. So it's not all of Western Europe, but instead some specific areas in Germany, especially along the Franco-German border, right along the Italian border, or actually I guess it's the Italian border with France and Germany, maybe Switzerland, I forget, some specific areas in Spain, right? And then also some specific areas when we talk about Russia and we talk about Eastern Europe. Right? And a lot of those areas, especially those areas in Ukraine now, are not manufacturing as much simply because of the chaos that's going on there. All right, and the areas in Russia are suffering because of these sanctions that have happened over what's going on in Ukraine, but these are still pretty major manufacturing areas even today. When we talk about our industrial areas in North America, really what we're talking about, there's a handful of areas in California on the West Coast. It's largely textile manufacturing, by the way. But when we're talking about heavy industry, really what we're talking about oftentimes is the East Coast. And we're talking again around those Great Lakes, right? A little bit into Ontario, but a lot of it, most of it's in the United States. And a lot of that is steel manufacturing, car manufacturing, those types of things. Slowly but surely across time, by the way, we've seen those areas grow smaller and smaller and smaller, and a lot of that manufacturing moves south with the changing materials and also with changing labor conditions and the like. So that's been our lecture, talk a little bit about where are major industrial locations. We looked a little bit at kind of where are they at in Europe. We looked a little bit at North America. We talked touch about Asia, and we also talked about kind of the origins of the Industrial Revolution, how it spread and where it spread to. If you have questions, I'd invite you to bring those to me in class, and I guess I'll see you the next time we meet.